welcome to Grappling with the Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I would like to welcome my guest today. With me is Sam Ardery, who's a national mediator, trial lawyer, consultant, speaker, and author. He teaches negotiation at Indiana University's Maurer School of Law and is author of Positively Conflicted: Engaging with Courage, Compassion, and Wisdom in a Combative World. J.C. Glick is a retired Army Ranger Lieutenant Colonel. He's a leadership strategy and culture advisor, as well as CEO of the Commit Foundation, an organization that helps high-performance veterans find their next adventure. And Scott Mason, also known as the Myth Slayer, is a speaker, podcast host, and coach working with executives and entrepreneurs to magnetize and monetize professional freedom by dislodging toxic myths to ignite the charisma within. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with me today.
Glad to be here.
Thank you.
And here is today's ethics challenge. Imagine that you've just completed your skating, diving, or gymnastic event to win Olympic bronze. You are elated to have earned the right to stand on the podium and receive your medal. Minutes later, you discover that because of a scoring error, the athlete who had been ranked 5th actually came in ahead of you to take 3rd. Would you argue that once the results have been announced, the decision is irrevocable, or would you graciously return the medal that you hadn't actually earned in the first place? This, of course, is exactly what happened in the recent Olympic Games, when judges misscored U.S. gymnast Jordan Chiles and awarded the bronze to Romania's Bǎrbosu. Then, moments later, stripped the medal from Ms. Bǎrbosu and gave it to Ms. Chiles until the next day, when the judges reversed themselves again, instructing Ms. Chiles to return her medal because she had failed to submit her review within the 60-second filing period, missing the window by 4 seconds. Days after the debacle, the International Gymnast Federation president finally addressed the issue, blaming the controversy on the lack of technology used in the judging process. A non-apology apology which satisfied virtually no one. Judges are human beings, so judging errors can happen, painful as they are. But it's often what we do after we make mistakes that matters most, and how we plan ahead to minimize mistakes when they happen. Is a 60-second window for filing an inquiry reasonable? Especially considering that every athlete except the one who goes last is given 4 minutes. Does it matter that the judges accepted the inquiry when, because it was late, they shouldn't have accepted it at all? Should there even be a limit when a judging error deprives a deserving athlete of a medal? And once the error has been made, should the feelings of the undeserving athlete who was told she had won figure into the resolution? Both athletes, Chiles and Bǎrbosu, asked to share the bronze medal. Apparently, the Olympic Committee did not go along with that. Would that have been the right decision? Or should actual performance scoring be the only criterion? The floor is open.
I want to hear from the lawyer.
Well, there are two of us. Scott's a lawyer too, right?
That's right. Okay, so I'm the only non-lawyer on here.
Maybe that means we need to hear from you.
Yeah.
Oh, hey, you learned that? Okay, so from the non-lawyer, I live with one. Does that count? Let me see. Look, I think the right answer would have been they should have shared it. Some bureaucrat, created some rule that says, okay, it's 60 seconds, and a bunch of people made a mistake. And I think, and I'm not I think fair and equal are real difficult terms, but I think what's fair is, hey, the athletes both said, we'll share this. Like, we'd like to share in this joy. You kind of made a mistake. If we let a bureaucrat make that decision of, no, you can't do that, well, show me where it says I can't do that. I think that's a mistake. And I think that a number of ways the Olympic Committee continues to shoot itself in the foot and believe that they are somewhat above and beyond reproach in a lot of the things that they do. I think there was also an issue with how horses were being treated, and they were completely missing the boat on that. I don't think I don't think the Olympics is a very well-run organization, and it doesn't have a lot of oversight. So from my perspective, let them share it. Especially, technology error. Come on, you screwed up. Just admit you screwed up, and the athletes have to pay for it now.
I agree with that outcome, particularly if you've got the two primary players that are willing to be gracious to one another. Why decide you're not willing to let them do that? I think it's deciding what justice is or fairness is, and you said this, JC, I think can be really hard because it's in the eye of the beholder. I mean, I've got a job as a mediator because two people's common sense didn't work to get something done. Then their first trip to the lawyer didn't get something done. Then the lawsuit didn't get something done. And then they come to my office. And they're both deeply vested in what they think is fair, and they're inconsistent. So I think that is just part of a reality of life for people. We can think things are fair in very different ways. And it's happened to me too. I want to be careful that I'm not throwing stones in that regard. Their process is poor. I think it starts where this started really being a problem is where the Olympic Committee started making excuses instead of taking responsibility. I mean, I pulled up the Olympic Committee's their website, and they said their values are excellence, respect, and friendship. And so sometimes I'll look at, I want to compare how the behavior measures against how someone claims their values to be. And I would say they failed in all three. And so I think there are a lot of ways to go with it, but I think they failed their own values.
Well, that's an ongoing discussion in many areas. The values can't just be posted on a wall. They have to be part of the culture. Otherwise, it's just lip service. Scott, what do you have to say?
I'm glad that you mentioned culture. As you and many other people know, I speak about how Greek myths exemplify leadership ideals. Now, I'm going to very briefly talk about one that's directly applicable to this situation. There was a massive boar called the Caledonian boar that was tearing through an ancient Greek city, and heroes from around the ancient world went to kill this monster that was threatening an entire city-state with starvation. A woman named Atalanta shot an arrow that crippled or at least sort of halted the boar in time for another hero named Meleager to step in and actually kill it. Technically, according to the rules of the game, the male hero was awarded the prize and the acclaim for killing the Caledonian boar. But he himself acknowledged that it would not have been possible but for Atalanta's arrow. And so he gave the award to her. What was the outcome? She was acknowledged for her role. Her excellence and the pivotal nature of what she did has rung throughout history. Meleager also was acknowledged as not only a hero, but a hero who demonstrated grace. What are myths but expressions of heroic cultural values, of the optimal ways in which we are to behave? What I'm hearing when I hear this story is an obsession with linear technocratic thinking as opposed to an actual expression of values. I'm so glad that the value statement was mentioned a few minutes ago, because that's ultimately what drives us. If we are so committed to a linear process, even when it takes us right over the cliff and into hell, then we really are morally bankrupt. That's a tragic way to be.
Well, and you use the term, go ahead, JC, I'm sorry.
No, please. All I was going to say is Scott and I are completely aligned in this one.
I don't know how it happened. I'm going to just switch my position.
Well, I was thinking when Scott was talking, you used the word grace. And at least in my tradition, grace means unmerited favor. You're given something that you don't necessarily deserve out of the kindness of others. And I think both these athletes displayed grace. They each had, I mean, the legal system is the opposite of grace. It's fight till the end and let somebody decide it. But in mediating, I mean, I've mediated 5,000 cases. I've seen multiple times where one side or the other has shown some grace to end something, saying, and the thing I come away with, and we talk about our kids are all grown now, but my wife and I talk about this all the time. Being right is really expensive and way overrated. And yet we worship at the altar of righteousness routinely. And it creates all kinds of humanitarian errors, relationship errors. I mean, think about scorekeeping in relationships that people might be inclined to naturally do. I mean, grace is to set it. I might naturally score keep in my relationship, but my job, I think, if I'm doing it well, is to set aside that scorekeeping and behave differently than I might instinctively feel at any given moment. And the Olympic Committee, I think, was the opposite of this, and the athletes were the example of it.
And the way you framed it, Scott, is it just goes back to one of my favorite tropes, that the difference between compliance and ethics. Compliance is all about checking boxes. It's the structure. You need a rubric, you need rules, you need regulations, but then you need the common sense how to apply those rules in a way that really seeks to achieve the best possible outcome. And what you were describing, and the way I heard it, was that this over reliance on the technical rules without serious consideration for the deeper, truer picture.
I have to also add something here. Of course, I mentioned a Greek myth because that's what I talk about, but think about it. What was the origin of the Olympic Games? They were founded by Hercules, and they were founded as a way to bring together warring states in a spirit of shared values. They weren't founded by Hercules because Hercules wasn't going to sit down and write all these rules. They weren't founded in the spirit of technocracy. They were founded in the spirit of larger mores of ethics.
I think that is the bigger issue here. And I think Scott nailed it, right? The Olympic Committee has become one of those organizations that the organization has gotten too big for itself. It has become elitist. It has become, thinks it is beyond adjudication. It thinks it's special. In fact, it does a lot of stuff. You know, I have friends who are Olympians, and they talk about some of the stuff that they're forced to do from the Olympic Committee. It's ludicrous. It's absolutely some of the dumbest things I've ever heard. And I think that if you really went back to the roots of what this was supposed to be, right, where athletes were supposed to come together to really compete in a way that wasn't war, that wasn't violent, you know, and come together with these shared values. I mean, I am constantly curious on how we got to where we are. And my guess is, you know, there's corporate influence, there's commercialization, there's all this other stuff that has something to do with it. But, you know, why isn't the Olympic Committee filled with athletes, which, by the way, take a look at the board, used to be a bunch of athletes, not so much anymore. Why isn't it filled with a bunch of athletes who are talking about athletics as opposed to, you know, well, here's the rule for this. Look, you know, and I understand, and again, you know, we look at the times and the heights, and like it's not even close what we can do now. And the margin of error, what was it, like less than a tenth of a second that determined the 100?
Yeah.
Look, it's hard, and it's not going to be perfect. And, you know, we're going to get it wrong sometimes, we're going to get it right sometimes. But if we're truly thinking about what this is supposed to do, which is supposed to bring a bunch of nations together to celebrate their athletes, why aren't we doing that? Like, we're missing the boat. As soon as those two athletes said, we'll share it, great, awesome, come on, let's go. I just, you know, I think we have created a bureaucracy. I hate bureaucracies. I think that Olympians need to become anarchists in the sense that they say, prove to me why you should be in charge of us. And, you know, I really think it's the system that I think we need to talk about, not just this incident. The system is broken.
Well, don't you think that systems often exist to perpetuate themselves? I mean, when I think about what the Olympic Committee did, and I often think when there are bad responses to things, that fear of some kind is at the heart of it. And so the Olympic Committee has this happen. They think, oh, there's uncertainty, and uncertainty scares people, and they want control. And then they think, oh, if we don't get this under control, what's going to happen? Rather than, and you mentioned common sense, and we all think we have the right amount of common sense, but bureaucracies have no common sense. And so as long as they're there and thinking that they're forgetting their values, and they're there to protect whatever their reputation is, rather than what ought to be done in the moment, they've lost it. And they're too big, and there's too much money. They're not going to back off. But I think I was, as we were thinking about this, and I was listening to the two of you and talking about it. I mean, at the heart of this, I think for the Olympic Committee is fear. I mean, it's just fear. And so they want to find an excuse and not own it and be responsible, when they could have lowered the temperature for all this if they'd acknowledged a mistake and said, why don't we honor these two athletes for their generosity to one another?
So what are they afraid of?
Well, I think they're afraid of lack of control. I think people in control really don't like. I mean, I think about when I do the difference between the way I mediate now and the way I mediated 30 years ago. I was deeply invested in control, almost like the school principal. I thought, I've got to come in here. These people are in here. Now I let people yell at each other. They can do whatever they want. I mean, I don't, not weapons or really hurting each other, because I find for me to do it otherwise is me thinking that I have more control and more wisdom than the people that are at the heart of it. And I think that's really what the Olympic Committee did. They were afraid of losing control, and then they ignored the people at the heart of it that came up with such a beautiful solution in the way they were treating one another. And the Olympic Committee got in the way of that. And I can relate to it because I don't like losing control either. I want to think, golly, somebody's hired me. I ought to have the answer, which is just baloney. But golly, when I'm afraid of my reputation or my ego or self-esteem or any of those things, I tend to respond badly.
And in the comments, Annette says we've confused being right, quotation marks, with being ethical. And I think it speaks to your point exactly. It's not, it's being seen as being right, regardless of whether we are in the right. And that's dangerous, because I'm going to go to any length to rationalize, to justify, to rewrite reality so that we can claim we have the moral high ground when we have anything but. Yeah, Scott.
Thank you. I will offer some, though, defense of bureaucracy here. Realistically, the Olympics have grown to a size and scale and involve a number of different cultures, to the extent that I feel a regulatory framework that governs it is extraordinarily necessary. And that regulatory framework is due to the sheer number of stakeholders involved, which don't just include the athletes, they don't just include the countries, they include the donors, they include a whole host of other things, probably will then throw down the necessity of a highly process-oriented framework in order for anyone to feel as though it's being operated in a way that's remotely transparent, leaving aside its failures. That being said, again, linear thinking is, in terms of how these processes can look, is something that is limiting, but can ultimately resolve these things. So for instance, a lot of highly bureaucratized processes have catch-all frameworks in which, for instance, just two examples could have been in this example. If there is a dispute and the disputing parties come up with an amicable resolution, so long as it doesn't violate other principles, then the committee is allowed to accept it. Or the committee can always say that to the extent that a process or other issue comes up and the result violates the spirit of the Olympics, then we have the right to move in that direction, so long as it's explained. Either of these could have provided an outlet for this. I will say, I don't necessarily disagree with this desire, with this fear-driven motivation. However, let's face it, for better or worse, and I don't think anyone in their right mind would deny what I'm about to say, we live in an era in which optics matter more than substance anyway. And so perhaps the Olympic Committee isn't as guilty as they might seem, because what they also have to respond to is a culture where people's lives, ruins, entire enterprises can get destroyed based on a single finger being pointed on social media. How can they not have some fear when it comes to that?
Well, even if that's true, so let's say you're right about that with the optics. I think when it comes to light, and I'm sure there were churning stomachs as the Olympic Committee tried to deal with this, a great place to turn, and this goes back to Jonassen's overall stuff he does with ethics anyway. That's my technical name, overall stuff you do with ethics. Is you can look back at what your values are. So if you say, okay, our values are excellence, respect, and friendship, how does the decision we're about to make with these two athletes consistent with that? The other thing that I think is important is I think you can have bureaucracy can have value, but it's not inherently good or bad any more than we are individually necessarily inherently good or bad. But there are other parts. You could have an ombuds person. You could have in government, we have inspector generals who are there to check things out when an organization is not doing things right, or to at least investigate those things. And they are there and possibilities. But I think the fear piece, I'm not asking the Olympic Committee to be fearless. I'm asking them to act ethically in spite of their fear, which I would argue is courage.
And
Exactly. I was going to say that's courage.
That's it. And I'm not saying no bureaucracy. I'm saying that when a bureaucracy overcomes governance, then it's not good. Do you need a bureaucracy? Yes, but a bureaucracy is supposed to support governance. Governance is strategic and thoughtful and creates the rules, and the bureaucracy enforces the rules. When bureaucracy gets ahead of governance, right? I think governance worries about ethics. I don't think bureaucracies do. And I think it's something that we see in the military all the time. They are always concerned with what do the rules say? Not what do the ethics say? What's ethically right? But what do the rules say? If the rules say I can do this, then I can do it. Well, and if they say I can't, regardless of what's ethically correct. And what we see certainly in the military, where we have a large bureaucracy, we have governance over that bureaucracy, and organizations in the military that fail allow that bureaucracy to overtake the governance. And we kind of become laissez-faire with our governance. And I look at it as, a lot, sometimes it's civilians in bureaucracy with what we used to call green suiters in the Army. And green suiters would go, yeah, they're running it, they got it, and let them go. And I think that may be what's happening with the Olympics. Is I think the bureaucracy is overcoming the governance, and I don't think you can have a successful organization with that.
And isn't the heart of governance really, when I was listening to you, I was thinking of the word trust. I mean, the reason we have rules because rules apply, but if we want to trust the people that are on the front lines because things come up that the rules don't necessarily address, or there may be time where the rules need to be changed. And I think that's the trust piece that I think is a challenge, not only in the Olympics, but in so many other organizations. I mean, I had somebody say to me in a mediation one time, I think we're going to lose this case, but I'm better off blaming it on a bad jury than going back and asking my corporate head for more money. And so it wasn't about trust. It wasn't about good decision-making. It was about, this is the best way to preserve my job, which probably wasn't a bad decision for that person, but there was no trust in the organization.
Yeah, that's going to be fatal eventually. But the rule, if we get into the bureaucracy, I think that most of the time, the people making these rules think they're doing what's best. Every athlete had 4 minutes to file an inquiry, except the last one. Why? Apparently because they want to keep things moving. So 4 minutes was the time allotted to the next athlete. So it made sense to pick that as the number. When there are no more athletes, they chose 1 minute. Now, if you're focused completely on efficiency, we want to keep things moving, people don't want to wait around long, it makes perfect sense. But when you broaden your perspective and say, wait a second, we are now penalizing one athlete by creating this narrow window, is that something that's consistent with what's equitable, what's right, what's fair?
Well. That's a very interesting question. When I was in law school, there was a new curriculum that was implemented that was forced on my class of 1Ls. And one of the foundational courses, in fact, it was deemed so foundational that it was a required course for everyone in the first semester, was law and economics. The school wanted to make sure that we all were very aware of a school of thinking that valued economic efficiency as the core outcome driver of the legal system that we were about to step into. And so the problem with, I personally, my heart, my spirit, everything that I stand for agrees with you. But one of the big lessons for that, from that whole experience that is directly applicable here, is that there are people out there that would say efficiency matters more than anything. In fact, there are people out there that were willing to argue that efficiency should be the major driver of our entire constitutional justice system. Who are we to say?
Who are we to say? That's an interesting topic.
Well, I find,
JC?
Go ahead.
no, I'd like to hear from you, JC.
Look, I think I don't want to, it's a false binary choice, right? You can be effective and efficient and fair, and you can do all those things, and it's a balance. And I think you have to be thoughtful. Rabbi, I'm not sure that those people think what they're doing is right. I think they're doing what they think is easy. I think they're doing what they think makes sense for the process and not the people. And I think that's what bureaucrats have to do, right? It's process, not people. Governance is people, not process, right? And that's that balance that has to happen. And I think that, the goal is, in good governance means I create rules with people in mind, and let me go back. We have a saying when I was growing up in the Army. It was mission first, people always. And the idea was the mission must be accomplished, but every decision you make impacts people. So you have to constantly be thinking about how it impacts your people. So notice it doesn't say people first, because if I want to keep all my people safe, they don't go do any missions. They stay in this country. We don't even go anywhere. Like, stay here and we'll protect you, right? Mission first means the mission has to be accomplished, but people always, I've got to be thinking about how it impacts. How do I minimize risk? How do I think about how whatever I'm asking them to do impacts them? Bureaucrats think about mission. I got to get the mission done. Governance thinks about people, and together what we do is hopefully have mission first, people always. And I think that if cooler heads had prevailed, and I do believe that fear is a driving factor, and as Scott put, and I agree, like it should be, they had already taken a ton of heat. Sorry, that's my dog. Somebody came to the door. Didn't expect that. They had already taken a ton of heat for whatever reason, whether it was justified or not, on opening ceremonies. And now I feel that they were in defense mode anyway. Then this whole thing, and you got to look into what happened with the horses, because the dressage horses, like there's like some serious issues at how they were treating the animals, and they're supposed to oversee that. And I think that you get a little, they're not bad people. I think you get a little tunnel vision, right? You just like, I got to get this right. I'm worried about this, and I focus on the end state. I focus on the mission and I forget about the people. And I see that happen. I think leaders do that a lot, especially when they have a bad quarter. I think, man, both of you as lawyers, as a guy who's been through a divorce, I think that we forget a lot about people in divorce. And man, that's like that was driving everything, is the people's emotions, but we make it into a business, and you forget about kind of the pain that happens there. So I think my thought is, look, I think you can have all of it. I think you can have efficiency. It won't be perfect. I think you can be effective. It won't be perfect, because you got this people, and they're squishy, and they're different, and they do different stuff, and they're irrational, and you do the best you can. And I think that if you do the best you can with what you got, I think people will give you grace.
And that's why, transparency is so important, because, and I love that the term you use, false binary, because it's one of my favorite terms. I think most of our binaries are false because we live in a world that's messy.
Yeah.
And it's complicated and it's filled with competing priorities. And I can have two core values that are both absolutely foundational to my beliefs. Sometimes I have to choose one over the other. But when there's a transparent process of how we make that decision, and it is reasoned, and it is thoughtful, and there is evidence that it is motivated by a genuine intent to do the best we can, then I believe people can live with it. Especially when there's an effort to say, well, maybe there's a third way. Maybe we can find some kind of principled compromise so that we don't have to have a win-lose. We can somehow honor everybody and every side. And if not, we've done our best.
Well, a lot of what was driving fear as I'm hearing the conversation is people concerned about their jobs or the financial implications or reputational implications of whatever it is that they do. And so the question becomes then, how do we put ourselves in a position where, as a cultural matter, whether it is with regards to this organization or others, where we can allow people to do that? And just thinking about the political sphere or the business sphere, too often the call when someone makes a decision that's extraordinarily unpopular, or especially when it's not transparent and appears self-serving, is for quote unquote accountability. Accountability, I believe, usually means, or ideally would mean, acknowledging that you made a mistake or acknowledging that something could have done differently, being honest about that, and then committing to moving forward differently. And if there is any sort of penalty that has to be paid, then doing your best to fulfill that. But that's not how I understand accountability when it's called in the public sphere. What I hear it as punishment. And if we are living in a culture in which we are primarily seeking punishment, how can the larger discourse shift as everywhere we go?
And so much of it goes back to the optics, as you mentioned before. I was reminded of a story I heard. I wish I could tell you who the parties were involved, but a baseball player hit the ball, ran to first base, got there in time ahead of the throw. The umpire shouted safe and then waved his thumb and made the out signal. And the first baseman looked at him and the runner looked at him, and he said to the runner, I know you're safe, you know you're safe, but everybody in this stadium thinks you're out, so you're out. And I've often reflected on that story. Now we have various ways of reviewing these things. But there are times when we really do have to step aside for the optics. And there are other times that it's simply wrong to do that. And trying to navigate that conflict or that contradiction is just another element here.
Well, I was thinking how beautifully JC said it when he talked about mission first, people always. And then you've talked about transparency several times today, and Scott brought up grace. I was thinking how beautiful this could have been had the Olympic Committee been transparent and been thinking about mission first, people always, and decided when we look at our values, they are to ultimately show grace. That's the principle on which these games were founded. And they didn't do any of it. When I get up in the morning, after the way I end my kind of time of prayer and meditation is I say, I want to let go of my desire for esteem and affection, for power and control, and for comfort and ease, because those are the three things that scare me the most. And what I've learned is anytime I get the knot in my stomach or my palms get sweaty, I need to go back to that, because one of those three things has got me scared. And it's a time for me to pause, not to act. And I think they got in a hurry, worried about whatever their fears were. And I think they acted too quickly, not thinking about what their core values were. And this is what happened.
I love everything you just said. I love that. I think, it's funny, my wife Jen and I were having a conversation the other day. We were talking to my youngest son relationship, and I said, look, sometimes, and again, this is not news to anybody here, but if the relationship means more to you than, the principle or the point, it's okay to acquiesce and be like, okay, sorry. And I'll tell you that though I won't do it on things that I feel very strongly about, though I will tell you, the older I get, the less strongly I feel about things, because the less I think I know. It's really easy for me to go, man, I'm sorry. Yeah, my bad. Let's do it another way. And I've found that, like, I'm not missing anything. I'm not losing anything. And I don't feel like I'm, weak, or I just go, like, there's a bunch of stuff that, when I was 30 something, 20 something, it was worth arguing about. I guess I thought, I don't think it's worth, like, life's way too, I got way little time left that I'm going to argue about stupid stuff now.
That is a fair way to step into the vacuum that can happen when you're forced to make those decisions. And as was mentioned earlier, okay, this is a time where my fear is creeping up, grabbing my heart, holding it tight. How can I step back to say, like, really, what is the big picture here? What really matters the most? And having worked in government bureaucracies for 20 years, I'm fully aware that there are people that will say nothing matters more than subsection AC1 of that rule. But most people won't. Most people will say, exactly, people first, or the mission, or some larger objective. In the case of the games, again, purely as an example for a larger way of thinking, including overall equity and furthering the goal of the Olympics to bring together a sense of harmony in a world that often doesn't have it.
I'd like to take a little bit of a turn to a topic that I alluded to in the beginning, but we didn't get to. I think at this point in my life, I can't say for sure, but I would hope at this point in my life that if I were given an award and it was then discovered that I hadn't actually earned it, that I would be willing to give it back. As a teenager, I question whether I would have taken that approach, and so I don't put unreasonable expectations on these athletes. But what about that? Here you have one athlete who clearly won, one athlete who clearly didn't, and the whole issue is over technical aspects of how to deal with judging errors. From a purely objective point of view, should we take the feelings of the athletes into account? Or even objectively speaking, is there something bigger here than just who actually won the competition?
I'm going to go back to the story of the Caledonian boar. Recall, the person who killed the boar only did it because Atalanta shot the arrow. That actually was what caused the defeat of the boar. Even though the person who won the award struck the blow, he gave the award to the person who actually caused the victory. That's exactly the point of this story.
But is it though? Are the cases comparable? Because there,
yes.
And you have me thinking that in hockey and basketball, we count assists, not only scores, but there together they brought about the result. Here, I don't see the comparison.
Well, I see the comparison because here the situation justifies it even more. If in the Caledonian boar situation, it's morally ambivalent, but he was deemed honorable by giving it to the person who actually caused that, then if you didn't even earn the thing, the case is easy. the story points to the values based on a case that's marginal, so that it's easier for us to see when it's not as marginal. And to me, that makes it pretty clear. That could just be me, though.
No, look,
Jason,
here's
I don't know
the deal.
everything.
I look at sport differently than I look at a lot of other things, and I think we make sport a metaphor for a lot of things, and I'm comfortable with that. We make it a metaphor for war, we make it, for battle, for life and death, and I get that, and I'm comfortable with all that. But the truth is, it's sport. It's sport, and I think that we have to start to realize that it's entertaining, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, it matters to the people who do it. It's an accomplishment. Congratulations. That's great. And I don't know that you haven't changed the space program. You haven't changed the medical community. You're entertaining. It's awesome. And I'm sorry, like, give everybody a medal. Like, when people are like, hey, give everybody a medal. I don't care. I really don't care. It's sport. Like, it doesn't matter to me. And I think it used to, because that's where I was. But as I look at it and I see the importance of, like, it's entertaining, it's enjoyable. I think it's a great metaphor. It's a great teaching tool, and it's a sport. And you're great at a sport, and that's awesome. And we've valued that in this country, in the world, and we've elevated you to a place that's very different than what the Greeks did. They were elevated, but like, we didn't pay them all this money because they were great at a sport. And I mean, we've kind of brought ourselves to this point. So I sit there and go, no, I would like to believe that at this point in my life, if somebody said, hey, I know we said you won, but you didn't. Okay, that's fine. Because what I know is I either came in ahead of the guy or I didn't. And at the end of the day, it's not going to change my life at all.
Well, and I think, going to your question too, Jonathan, you said, if it's absolutely clear, and I think we're making decisions every day in life, what we're going to fight against and what we're going to surrender to. And I think part of the issue, if I'm an Olympian, is ultimately somebody has the say. I mean, in the United States, if you disagree, if you don't want dueling in the streets, you go to a courtroom and judges decide. You go to the Court of Appeals, and we can disagree, but we've surrendered to that system. And I think in this case, if I'm an Olympian, I've surrendered to the International Olympic Committee, and they get to decide. And I may disagree with what happened with the appeal and with the judging, and I don't even know. They probably think it's clear different ways, is my guess. And they can justify it however they want. But I think if I've surrendered to a system, and if the system decides I didn't win the medal, I give the medal back. Just like if I've sued somebody for money and the jury decides I don't get the money, I don't get to go take the money from the people. It's just the way it goes. And as much as we fight about it, we kind of have this individualism. We want rogues out there fighting, but ultimately, if we don't surrender to some kind of a system, then we really do have anarchy. And I think there's a place for anarchy, actually. But I think broadly, societally, in a place like the Olympics, you decide what you're going to fight against and what you're going to surrender to, and that makes the decision.
I mean, I think that's self-evident that there has to be a system and that we have to accept it. And if we don't, then everything crumbles. At the same time, I think it's important for us to evaluate how well the system's working and consider what we can do to always try to make it better. I'd love to continue this in the second segment. If you gentlemen could stick around for a few more minutes, but we're going to wrap up this segment. I would like to thank you all for a really wonderful conversation. When we get to the point where we have the best of series, this I'm sure will be among them. So thank you, Sam Ardery, JC Glick, and Scott Mason, for a really compelling conversation. For those of you who are watching or listening, if you have a topic you would like us to take up, please go to my website, ethicsninja.com, use the contact information. Submit your idea if it's compelling. We will take it up on a future episode. And until then, encourage you to continue always grappling with the gray.